I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And this is our podcast on The Dreamstone, a cartoon which aired in 4 series on CITV between the very end of 1990 and the very early part of 1995. First, some general comments and memories, and then we'll have a little talk about the characters, as that's going to be quite a good way to talk about the show in detail. The Dreamstone was one of those shows that when it came up on what's coming up on CITV in the New Year adverts, such as we've mentioned before, I used to think, oh, the Dreamstone, coming back, we'll definitely watch that, that's one of our shows. And indeed we did. But it's also one that I remember thinking, walking along on my way to school, it's Friday, what's on after school? The Dreamstone, I'm getting a bit bored of that, I'm not sure I really want to watch it. I suppose I'll sit and watch it vegging out after school. And this was during, I should think, the 3rd series. I think I was in year 6, thinking about where I was actually walking to school and thinking this. And I was thinking earlier that one could describe the Dreamstone as a typical CITV cartoon fare, and I suppose it is in many ways, but it's also quite an ambitious production, quite an epic setup and story that falls short in a couple of ways that don't allow it to reach its full potential. One of those ways is, as Rosie was telling me yesterday, the premise is quite limiting. And that's what I used to find made me slightly, Dreamstone again. It's the same thing week after week. I'm a bit bored of it. And that's why I said at the end of the last podcast, it's basically the same episode 52 times. Which is quite a large exaggeration, but it is nevertheless based in truth. The premise is basically that the baddies are trying to get the Dreamstone off the goodies, and they try to do this in various ways and to various degrees of success throughout the 4 series. Rosie was also telling me that where you get variety in the show is how far the baddies actually manage to take the Dreamstone. In some episodes, such as the pilot, which is a double-length episode, and an episode from season 2 called Spilled It, the Dreamstone actually ends up in Viltheed, which is the baddies' headquarters. Like Snake Mountain in He-Man, it looks quite like Snake Mountain as well. But then in other episodes, the Dreamstone won't make it out of the Dream Maker's tower, despite the baddie's best efforts, which happened in an episode we watched on the DVDs that I have, the first 6 episodes, called Albert is Fishnapped. It never came out of the tower in that one. And then there was another one, The Invisible Blob, where the Dreamstone made it as far as the Dream Maker's front garden and didn't go any further towards Filthy. So there's your variation, different degrees of how far the Dreamstone is taken. And the other main drawback, I think, where it does fall short, is some of the voice work is inadequate, unfit for purpose. Not bad as such, but not what it needs to be. And we will come on to discuss that at length in a bit. As I was saying earlier, it is an ambitious production, and that's why the London Philharmonic Orchestra was brought in with composer Mike Batt to record all the soundtrack. They recorded Better Than a Dream, the kind of theme tune, and the Erpney song, and various bits of music that you hear throughout the show. And another thing Rosie was saying to me was that they'd spent so much money paying the London Philharmonic Orchestra and Melvin Hayes, whose character we'll talk about in a bit, they didn't have any other money left to do all the other things they needed to do. So perhaps they were too ambitious for their own good. It certainly sets out to do a lot, the show, explore the nature of good and evil, dreams and nightmares, light and dark. The planet has the light side, the land of dreams, the dark side, the land of nightmares, with the mist of limbo in the middle. A clear visual representation of some of the themes they're exploring there. The power of the Dreamstone keeps bad dreams, Argorables, which are these kind of purple wraiths that represent nightmares, keeps them at bay. And I always liked how Argorables shrink from sunlight, which the Dream Maker has in bottles and is able to use against them sometimes. Themes like that which come through but perhaps aren't fully realised, I did always find very appealing. So there's the general comments and introduction, and some of my memories.
I can't really remember what I used to think about it. I remember which characters I liked, and I shall say, when we talk about the characters, I think in 1990, when I was like 5, I probably enjoyed it being quite formulaic and repetitive, because young children do, and you know what you're getting, and you feel reassured that all is as it should be, but I can't remember having strong feelings about the show as a whole, but I do remember I enjoyed it.
That's an interesting point, actually, isn't it? It's like we were saying on our very first podcast about Nightmare, particularly Series 4 of Nightmare, which is often criticised, quite rightly, for being very formulaic, but when we were 5 and 7, we found that very comforting and very easy to engage with. So perhaps the truth is, when I was walking to school thinking, oh, I'm a bit bored of the Dreamstone, actually, I want to like it, but I can't as much as I want to. Perhaps I was just growing out of it as I was 11 or almost 11. So perhaps it's better for younger children. So now we'll talk about the main characters. We'll talk about the goodies first, I think.
We'll get the boring bit out of the way.
Well, that's right, there might be slightly less to say. And it's true, I think. Rosie, I think, has told me she feels this way in the past, and I think it's definitely true. The baddies are better, more interesting characters, and when they're on the screen, the show is better as a rule.
Yes, I did something about that sort of thing in my A-level psychology, about whether it's okay that people find baddies more interesting on television generally, but perhaps we better not get into that. When we were watching the DVDs, I was saying, mostly not joking, oh, this is boring in the land of dreams, I want to go back to the land of nightmares.
And perhaps this is underlined by the fact that almost every episode is told from the baddie's point of view, or starts with the baddies. It's part of the opening narration that we come to the baddies first and see what they're up to. So you always kind of sympathise with them, or see things starting off from where they are.
Yes, of course they're driving the action, aren't they, and trying to get the Dreamstone, and everything that the goodies do is reaction, preventative.
We were talking about the opening narration, how it goes. This is their commanding officer, Sergeant Blob, to start off, and we see what's going on, what War created that Blob is going to try and use to get the Dreamstone.
Probably some sort of aeroplane that doesn't work properly.
Quite. And Rosie said, oh, does that mean every episode starts with the baddies then? And I said, well, I think there's about 2 in the whole run that don't, and it will stop at the Urbanies. Meanwhile, in the land of dreams. And then Rosie was looking up episodes on YouTube, and you happened to find one of these couple of episodes that didn't start with this their commanding officer, Sergeant Blob. I mean, what are the chances?
I wanted to hear the opening narration that wasn't rubbish, like it is on the DVD, because it's a different person. Probably tell us all about that in a minute. But I just clicked on a random Series 2 episode, The Dreamstone 2 something or other, and it was one of the 2 episodes or so that doesn't start with "This is their commanding officer, Sergeant Blob," and that was a coincidence. So there we are. That's a great story, wasn't it?
2 may be a slight exaggeration, but if there's more than 4, I would be extremely surprised.
I remember I always used to expect it to say, "This is their commanding officer, Sergeant Blob."
Well, let's start with the narrator as character then. And in the first series, trying to evoke the kind of epic atmosphere and themes that I was talking about before, he utterly fails to do it. And when I first got the DVDs, I was very surprised to hear the opening narration read so badly, because in series 2, 3, and 4, they get Gary Martin, very talented and experienced voice man, who was already in the cast as Zordrak, as everybody knows, to take over as the narrator, and he does it so much better, both the opening narration and bits of narration during the actual story. That first narrator is awful.
He is awful. This occurred to me, and I didn't tell you at some point, but that original narrator probably recorded the opening narration before they animated it. So Gary Martin did have the advantage of having seen it, so when he's saying he's surrounded, protected, and what is it? Served by Erpneys, and then he's saying that they're dedicated and that kind of thing. I can't remember how it goes, sorry. But they're like picking their ears and stuff and crashing into the camera. He's seen that and he makes it sound like he knows that they're a bit crap. But the other guy, probably actually hadn't seen how it was going to go.
Yes, and they do things like they sync the loathsome lightning. Zordrak, close up of Zordrak. The animation's already there, so they can match up Gary Martin's new narration to it. So that's why it's like 500% better in series 2.
Having said that, the original guy just does read it quite badly, doesn't he?
Yes, it's a complete combination, and by matching it up and getting Gary Martin to do it after the first series, they make it very memorable and very effective. Thinking about that first narrator saying things during the actual action of the show, he was saying that something terrible had happened, Zordrak's Argorbles had been released, and there was nothing to protect the noobs from the nightmares. And you said, well, he makes it sound like that's fine.
Is that what I said?
Yes.
Well, I think I was right, wasn't I?
There was a good example of why that first narrator was inadequate.
He should realise that that's not fine, shouldn't he? Even if he doesn't realise that the Erpneys are not dedicated and highly trained. There we go, I remembered another bit.
But there we are, the main goody characters. Now, Rufus is ostensibly the main protagonist of the show. He's a noob.
They have sort of rabbit faces, green fur, horns, animal ears that I can't think what animal they look like.
And he's supposed to be quite a strong and compelling lead character, and in many ways it's supposed to be a sort of coming-of-age story for him, a bit like the Black Cauldron for that character called Tartaran. But that doesn't come across very often. It's partly the voice work, as we'll say in a moment, and it's partly because the baddies just ended up being better, more interesting characters and situations. But I was saying, they've been quite ambitious with Rufus. He's supposed to be a daydreamer, he's supposed to be proving himself, he's supposed to be finding his niche in becoming an apprentice dream maker, having failed at being an apprentice grocer, baker, and candle maker. He's finding that his natural affinity with dreaming and imagination has taken him down the right path towards dream making, and it's his story. But that does kind of get lost along the way, and the fact that his voice work isn't top-notch does add to that a lot. It's a very suitable voice. I think he's called Stuart Locke, the actor, and a lot of the time his voice work is actually adequate for what they're giving Rufus to do, but when he gets into the deeper, more emotional, more complex stuff that really should flesh out Rufus as a character and a protagonist, he sometimes falls a bit short, doesn't he?
Yes, I think so. He's got the same sort of voice to go with the same sort of character as Flicker in Blazing Dragons, would you agree?
Yes, and he always reminded me of Fox from Farthing Wood as well.
Oh, really? I think he and Flicker are a bit more sort of softly spoken than Fox.
That's true.
Humble and in the background more, but it's a fair point nonetheless. He was reminding me of Flicker a lot, though, and I was thinking how it might be a bit better if it was Ted Glenn doing the voice.
Do you know, that's a very good point. If you want to see how a character like Rufus should be done, look at Flicker in Blazing Dragons. And again, it's those things I was describing, isn't it? Coming of age, protagonist, doing the right thing, finding the right path. So I think that's a very good comparison. You were saying, oh, he's not very good at standing up to Zordrak, is he, for example? when he has to do that level of voice work, it doesn't quite come across as it should.
I can't even remember what was going on, but it was kind of defying Dordrak, saying, "Oh, I'm not going to let you take the Dreamstone, even though I'm just a nobody." Those weren't the exact words, but it's what he meant. And yes, I thought there could have been a lot more emotion and subtle feelings coming through in that.
And we'll come back to the other scene that I cite as where the voice work needs to be better in a moment, because it links in with Amberley. But one interesting factoid about Rufus is that the show was originally made as a pilot in 1985 in the USA, and Rufus was voiced by a 12-year-old Christian Bale, which I thought was very interesting.
That's random.
Because I'm Rufus. But it'd be interesting to hear if Christian Bale managed to inject any of that kind of flickerism into him that is missing, but I haven't ever been able to find a clip of it. But a point worth noting, nevertheless, I thought.
I think Rufus, as a child, might not work. He's meant to be a young adult, isn't he?
Yes, a young adult. Perhaps they were making him too childlike by casting someone that young there. So now we'll move on to Amberley, who is the other main noob. One can read on the Dreamstone wiki that she is actually named after the village of Amberley in West Sussex, which...
I read that on Wikipedia itself, too.
Oh, there we are.
I did think that was quite interesting.
Which the creator was fond of. He obviously didn't mind roundabouts where you can't actually sit down.
If you can visualise that.
Amberley was very near our regular childhood holiday place, so we have more than a passing familiarity with the village. And Amberley, the character, is Rufus's best friend, it's introduced as, and she is originally working for Mr. Wax, the candle maker, and then at some point she's also apprenticed to the dream maker. She starts off delivering his candles to be in it, and then it's not really very clear when she starts working for him as well. But she is, anyway, within a few episodes. And, well, Rufus is your protagonist. He needs a woman fellow protagonist to go along with, doesn't he, in this formulaic world. And there she is, Amberley. She's supposed to be quite feisty, a strong female woman, and to ground Rufus in some ways, I think. But her voice work is the one that I think really lets the show down quite a bit. It's a very good voice, it's a very nice voice, but she doesn't read the lines very well or very in-depth, does she?
No, she's supposed to be a flame to his flicker, of course, but when we started watching it, I did think Rufus was better than her, just doing stuff that didn't require a lot of emotion. She seemed to understand how Amberley was supposed to be feeling and try to act, but there wasn't really anything behind it, if you see what I mean.
It's not a bad performance, it's just inadequate for the level that the show is really aiming for. I often used to wonder what is the exact nature of Rufus and Amberley's relationship supposed to be, which is a very valid thing to wonder. They spend 52 episodes knocking around together, but they don't do anything overtly sexual, romantic. But neither is there any indication that they might not be doing anything sexual/romantic behind closed doors.
Not many people did overtly sexual things on CITV, did they? But I suppose
Arnold and Helga.
Yes, and Watto and Kylie too.
But I was interested to see on the wiki, it doesn't go into huge detail about the relationship between the two of them, but then on their kind of profiles, it says significant others, and under Rufus it says significant other, Amberley, wife.
Wife?
And under Amberley, Rufus, husband.
Since when?
And I don't know if that's supposed to be in some sort of future timeline. I've found some fan art of Rufus and Amberley with their baby, who's blue for some reason. But obviously people, maybe noobs are blue when they're very young and then they turn green.
Yes, that explains it.
But obviously some people have enjoyed Rufus and Amberley as a couple or a potential couple. There was a comment on YouTube I liked. Rufus and Amberly were my absolute favourite couple, as well as a couple of the Power Rangers and Simba and Nala from The Lion King. And I thought, oh yes, that really dates it to around the right time. But when I was first getting the DVDs, which was, I suppose, 10 years ago or slightly over now, I thought, what is the exact nature of Rufus and Amberly's relationship? And I was reading on the internet how in the pilot there is this scene where Zordrak has turned Amberly to stone, which is one of his standard magic powers, although you don't really see him using it up the pilot, where he's a lot more hardcore and wants to kill people. And Rufus comes across the stone Amberly in the corridors of Viltheed and brings her back to life by crying on the statue, or on the stone Amberly. And I posed a question to Rosie. What bodily fluid do you think Rufus has to emit onto Amberly to turn her back from stone? And Rosie quite correctly worked out tears. Now, this should be a very powerful scene. It should be, as I said when we were watching it the other day, the emotional crux of the whole pilot. It's actually love conquering death. It is an evil doer being undone by the fact that he does not understand love, and therefore love defeats evil. Evil has no power over love, which we have seen in many, many things. And many, many evildoers have been undone by not appreciating the power of love, not knowing that it can be greater than any other power in the universe, such as Voldemort didn't know that. It hugely brought about his downfall, such as the ultimate evil on the episode of the original He-Man, called Wizard of Stone Mountain. And in countless other things as well, you get that theme, don't you? Love conquers evil, love conquers death brought about by evil, or love redeems the soul that's been claimed by evil. You see it countless times, don't you?
Yes.
And I thought, well, that's pretty clear indication then that Rufus loves Amberly, and they're in love probably, and they're going to be having a sort of ship. And then when I finally saw the scene, I was extremely disappointed. It is rushed and flat. Rufus is talking about his feelings for Amberly as he cradles the statue and cries onto it. And he's not putting in the level of emotion necessary, I don't think.
He's doing a sad voice, so he understands what's going on, but not sad enough.
And then when Amberly comes back to life, she makes absolutely no reference to the fact that Rufus has rescued her from being a statue. She's immediately going on at him about, we have to find the Dreamstone. There should be some sort of moment between them there, and there's nothing even in the animation. We noticed that the animators did their best in a lot of places to flesh out the Rufus and Amberly interaction with looks between them and grasping hands and things. But there really wasn't any time to do it there. It's so rushed and inadequate, that statue crying scene. And it should be really good and memorable and the emotional crux of the pilot. Something that draws us into Rufus and Amberly as characters. So definitely a missed opportunity there, I think. There's this bit where Amberly's fallen asleep in a later episode, and Rufus is carrying her and putting her to sleep, and the Dreammaker's napping in a chair and looking at her very tenderly. And we think, yes, I see what they're trying to get across there. But there'd been nothing in the voice work of the dialogue leading up to that sequence of events that would indicate any such feeling between Rufus and Amberly. It was all added in later by the animators to kind of flesh out their relationship. The Dreammaker. As we discovered yesterday when looking at a Dreamstone recording session on YouTube, the Dreammaker was recorded with a scratch voice by Richard Tate, who voiced Sergeant Blob. And then later, they got in John Franklin Robbins, who I remember seeing as an old man in quite recent years on things like Midsummer Murders to fill in the voice of the Dream Maker. And yes, he does sound like, which Dream Maker is, a wise, old, Merlin-y wizard kind of thing. So I can see why they wanted his voice for it. Although Richard Tate's Dream Maker voice, scratch voice, was very good too, wasn't it?
Yes, it was fine.
So they should have just used him, really. And obviously the Dream Maker's role is to make the dreams, very much like the BFG does.
Yes, he mixes them in bottles and everything. It's a great big pile of plagiarism, really.
It was reminding us of the BFG there, and then it was reminding me of the Thundercats opening episode, where Rufus was using the Dreamstone without really knowing how to ward off Zordrak. Reminded me of the Eye of Thundera. The sword kind of did it for me. Sword of Omens. But yeah, the Dream Maker makes his dreams and sends them out through the Dreamstone. And what really sometimes annoyed me about him was that he doesn't seem to do a lot else. He doesn't really seem to get involved and fight the baddies and things. On the wiki it says he has extensive, largely unknown magical powers. The only really magic things we see him doing are floating instead of walking, and lighting a candle with his finger, which is a magical ability we've seen characters such as Morticia Adams and Professor Lupin in the third Harry Potter film do. So I always think it's kind of disappointing. Oh, the Earpneys have got the Dreamstone. Well, you better go after them, Rufus, even though I've only just met you, and I'm going to stay here and do absolutely nothing. And then in the one called Albert's Fishnap, where the Dream Maker's supposed to bring the Dreamstone in exchange for Albert out the bridge, it's a kind of hostage situation. And, oh, it wasn't the Dream Maker at all. It was Wildit in a Father Christmas costume. That means you're in trouble. I mean, if they were going to double-cross the Earpneys like that, surely the Dream Maker with his great magic should be best able of any of the goodies to deal with three Earpneys and rescue Albert, who was actually doing a pretty good job of escaping on his own anyway.
Incidentally, the Dream Maker was wearing a Father Christmas costume when they did that plan.
Yes, there was a fancy dress party.
Shall we talk about Albert next?
Well, why not?
Since you said how he's doing a good job of escaping on his own, he is extremely useful, isn't he? In more than one episode, he's the only one who knows what's going on, realises the Earpneys are there trying to steal the Dreamstone, and does anything about it.
Yes, by kidnapping him, they really should be able to get the Dreamstone, because he's the only one who realises and tells everyone, with his wah-wah-wah-wah-wah-wah and sort of charades, what's actually going on.
Yes, we haven't explained what he is, have we, for those who don't know?
He's described in the opening narration as the Dream Maker's watchdog fish, or a watchdog fish.
And because of that, and because I knew catfish were real, as a youngster, I thought dogfish was just a joke, like catfish, but I did learn otherwise at a very reasonable age, I think, before I was a grown-up. And yes, he's a fish with a dog's nose and a dog's bark, and he floats, or sort of swims through the air and blows bubbles, and has a dog collar on.
If you want to read about his origin, you can find quite widely reported that the Dream Maker saw Albert once in a dream and liked him so much that he brought him to life.
That needs explaining, does it? That Noops and Wuts and Earpneys and things like that don't?
Yeah, very much so.
Right, okay.
And if you look carefully, you can actually see 3 or 4 Alberts in Rufus's dream very near the beginning of the pilot episode. So it's obviously something that people dream about quite a lot, Albert-like things. Or maybe they're an actual race of dream-dwelling creatures, and the Dream Maker decided to pluck one out of the dream world for a pet. Very much interpret that as you want. We've already mentioned Wildit. The main Wat character, the Wats are the guardians of the land of dreams, the opening narration tells us, but they're forest folk, and they very much look a bit like trees.
Yes, and when they're children, apparently they're saplings. And I was like, he is a tree. I can't really get my head around that, doesn't make any sense.
But the main Wat was obviously originally supposed to be Pildit, who is the main Wat in the very early episodes, but then you see very, very little of him as the show goes on, and I don't think you enjoyed Pildred very much, did you? You kept saying it was annoying.
Yes, he has an annoying voice and he says stupid things.
But he gets completely usurped in the show by Wildit, and she even gets mentioned first in our podcast, you may have noted, before he got mentioned. And Wildit is his grandmother. And I always thought she was his grandmother, and then it later seemed that she has a niece who's younger than Pildred. Is that right? Or she's probably her great-niece. They've probably forgotten that Wildred's supposed to be Pildred's grandmother. But I don't know why they've used Wildred so much as the main what instead of Pildred. Maybe they just thought she was a better, more interesting, more amusing character. She's supposed to be wild and eccentric. Maybe that's Wildred, wild. Is supposed to be in her name. Amberly says, your grandmother's special, isn't she? Hilda goes, yes, she's a nutty old bat.
And I was like, is she? I hadn't really noticed.
But that doesn't really come across, does it? Again, the voice work. And we saw the lady, the slightly older lady, doing her voice work in this Dreamstone video recording session thing on YouTube. It's very good and engaging, but it's not quite as wild and eccentric as everyone seems to think the character is.
Well, I find Wildit more engaging than Pildred, I must say.
It's funny, in the 6th episode, Albert is fish-snapped, which I keep mentioning the title of. That's Wildit's first appearance, as it turns out. And she says at the end, doesn't she, do you think your friends, Pildred, would mind if I stay? And Pildred gives the camera a look like, uh-oh! And we say, yes, he knows he's going to be completely usurped in the show.
Yes, well, I mean, he does have a stupid voice, and I'm not being racist, but he's green, like the forest is green and the noops are green, and perhaps they thought Wildit being more sort of yellowish provided a bit more visual variety. And maybe they also thought, well, we've only got one girl in it, that's Amberly, perhaps we ought to have some more women in the main cast. So I can see why they did that.
All very true. Those are really the main characters, goodies. There's Mr. Blossom the gardener, who is an aged what who goes around the garden with his wheelbarrow complaining. And occasionally Rufus and Amberly will knock into him with their flying leaves, which they get from the Watts, and they both become very adept at flying them during the course of the series.
They're doing that in the recording session, aren't they?
Yeah, it's knocking over Mr. Blossom. And you see various noops around the place, various whats. And then I always remember they introduced, a little later, it turns out, in season 2, I was looking on the wiki, these things called wattles, which are like if whats were Pokemon or Digimon, wattles would be the evolutionary stage below whats. And apparently the wattles tend the dream bottle trees. Yes, the dream bottles aren't made of glass. They actually grow on trees.
I wasn't too keen on that when I saw that on your DVD.
But in that scene on the DVD, the Watts were harvesting the dream bottle trees and irrigating to make sure they would grow. So obviously they hadn't thought of the wattles at that point. But I guess the Watts only look after the trees at harvest time, and the wattles tend them, make sure everything's all right in the meantime.
They have a sort of hierarchy based on size.
Well, they do, really. I don't think the wattles are enslaved by the Watts or anything.
Bet they are. I bet they get beaten and that kind of thing.
But speaking of enslavement, over the other side of the Mist of Limbo, which underneath it has the Sea of Destruction, in which is the Isle of Catastrophe, we have the Land of Nightmares, the Black Mountain of Biltheed, and there Zordrak has enslaved the Earpneys, who are basically humanoid, but they have tails, spiky tails, and purple spots. And I was thinking just now, I don't think the Earpneys are necessarily a warlike race. We'll skip ahead a bit here and say when Zordrak turns nice, three main Earpneys, Sergeant Blob, Frizz, and Nug, seem perfectly happy that Zordrak's gone nice, and they're all going to have a nice time together from now on. They're just an enslaved race who are so scared of Zordrak, quite understandably, that they do what he wants. But let's talk about Zordrak first. He is the sort of character that I've always liked because he shoots lightning from his fingers and he's very powerful and very cool and extremely memorable. And he's the first living creature we see each episode when we come into the opening narration. First thing we see is the Black Mountain of Belfied. So he's obviously designed Zordrak to draw us into the show. The loathsome Zordrak, and he shoots lightning. Lord of Nightmares. I mean, that gets our attention, doesn't it?
Yes, possibly plagiarised off the Nightmare Prince from Potsworth and Co. But I think an improvement on him.
And as you were saying, they obviously didn't realise at the beginning that Zordrak is a renegade, disgraced, banished dream maker, and he used to be normal-sized, kind of fuzzy purple creature like his sister Zarag, who is also evil actually, but she's not huge and scaly and huge amounts of magic power and things.
I think originally it was just supposed to be a gigantic sort of dragon or something.
And they don't feature Zordrak as much, particularly as the show goes on. Sometimes there's only been like one introductory scene in the episode. And that was another thing that did make me go off the Dreamstone a bit, because I did like to see him shooting lightning and turning people to stone in the opening special. And he's very evil and ruthless in that opening special. The first thing we see is him feeding the Erpney captain, whose name I've forgotten, to his Frasnats, which are these carnivorous creatures that live in a pit, and Zordrak throw them and eat Erpneys whenever they get the chance.
Including stone ones. Rufus is quite happy that he can't cry on those Erpneys and bring them back to life, so he just throws them to the... I can't remember their names already.
Frasnats.
He just throws them to the Frasnats and they eat them, and they like eating Erpneys whether they're made of stone or not, but I bet they prefer ones that aren't.
And then Zordrak is attempting to be very ruthless at the end. Rufus and Amberley have got the stone back, and Zordrak spots them and goes, "So you would risk the wrath of Zordrak? Then die!" and shoots at them. And then, of course, the Dreamstone, like the Sword of Omens, deflects the evil power. But then Zordrak becomes a bit more passive and a bit less used. He's probably quite difficult, expensive to animate, like Stampede.
It's probably quite hard to keep up the voice as well.
Yes! And this is a very interesting thing about Zordrak. It's very memorable, very deep, resonant voice provided by Gary Martin. And I was wandering around, coming out of the kitchen yesterday evening, saying, I sometimes wonder if Zordrak's voice is at all digitally, electronically manipulated, or if Gary Martin just did it live.
I always thought it must be manipulated because it sounds manipulated, to be quite honest.
That's right, and I thought it probably was, but I thought it was possible that it was just a Gary Martin voice, because other things that I've heard him in, he does do a lot of very skillful, up and down, undulating voice work, and sometimes goes very nearly as deep as Zordrak. We've seen him and heard him in The Ink Thief as Lorny Snoop, where he does a lot of interesting voice work when appropriate. We've heard him in Red Dwarf 7 as Epideme, and we will podcast about Red Dwarf next year. It has been decided. Epideme is an alternative to the nicotine patch. It's a virus that stops you wanting to smoke and accidentally ends up taking over your body and killing you. You know, the sort of thing, sci-fi thing. And I was thinking in that when he goes, "What about that chicken you biryani'd last night, Lister?" He goes nearly as low as Zordrak there. And Gary Martin was also in Molly's Gang, fantastic stop-motion thing from the 90s that we used to enjoy tremendously.
Fantastic, was it?
It was diverting anyway. Doing some good voice work. And quite recently, I've heard him doing like CITV trailers. When we were watching all that Foot Boy on Ultimate Challenge, he's got a very distinctive voice. I don't know if he can still go as low as Zordrak nowadays, but he still obviously gets voiceover work. And he very much deserves it, because he's very good at it and his voice is very suitable. But on this video of the recording session, I was so interested to see that Gary Martin was actually doing the Zordrak voice live. And I thought, is it a special microphone? No, it's not a special microphone because the Earpgore actor is using it as well. So it's just a voice, an extremely deep voice that Gary Martin does, or did, 25 years ago. And what a very good, talented, memorable, appropriate bit of voice work that was. And then you'll also see on that video footage of him moving seamlessly into his narrator voice, which is clear, crisp, informative, quite sort of friendly, and is more like you'll hear him doing on CITV voiceovers.
He calls us dear viewer, doesn't he?
That's right.
When we feel very reassured that he cares, that we're watching the show and that kind of thing.
So Gary Martin, a great voice asset. Oh, I know the other main thing we've heard his voice on, you remember? The Baskervilles.
Oh, yes. Something else that was not what it should be.
Where he played the boss, who was possibly the devil. Bring your family to Underworld, the theme park, and have a really bad time when you go there. He blows Zordrak there.
And he could go on the list of characters who are the actual devil.
Yes. So Zordrak was always a highlight of the show for me. But let's mention, before we come to the end of Zordrak, the very funniest bit. I don't believe there could be any funnier bit in the whole show, where Zordrak becomes nice at the end of the episode from season 2 called Spilled It. Now, there is an explanation for why Zordrak has become nice. He's gone off in his mist form and left his body, which is extremely memorable and something I did remember watching him doing and being quite excited by.
I don't remember that.
From when it was first on.
I remember it now, but not from when it was first on.
He turns into a sort of Argorable, a big one with red eyes, and he had to do it in this episode called Spilled It to go and restore his evil powers on the red planet of Doom. Okay, we'll buy that, for various reasons that were rather forced and not really properly gone into. He accidentally became good on his way back into his body. And it doesn't matter why that happened, because the resulting scene was absolutely brilliant. As we mentioned earlier, it's one of those episodes where the Dreamstone gets into Vilfeed, and Zordrak, of course, is disapproving, now he's a nice person, of finding the Dreamstone there. This belongs to the Dreammaker, does it not? And Hercule goes, not anymore, it doesn't. And then Zordrak says what must be the best line in the whole thing. This is very naughty, Hercule. And you wouldn't hear him saying that normally. And he makes Hercule return the Dreamstone with his apologies and flowers.
Yes, if you wanted to pick that to pieces, you might say, well, he's not going to actually do anything to Hercule if he doesn't, so why is Hercule bothering to obey him? But, never mind.
And Gary Martin did particularly well, I think, maintaining the Zordrak voice, but making it a friendly voice. It was almost as deep as it had been before. Extremely talented he was there, and indeed in all his scenes. And I think that's a prime example of how scenes with the villains are generally better. That one is hilariously funny, and it builds on what we know about the villain characters to make the humour and make an engaging scene. I don't think you could really get that kind of quality of scene with the goodies of the Dreamstone. And that's the bit, as I say, where Blob, Frizz and Nug, the main Erbneys, are quite pleased to join in with Zordrak being nice. And Frizz and Nug are singing Beautiful Dreamer for him, and Zordrak's applauding and saying, very good, very good. They're very talented, and they're very pleased. And that could have been a very nice new status quo, but unfortunately Blob accidentally makes Zordrak get hit on the head with a rock, and he becomes evil again. But a definite highlight, that. And we watched that episode. Rosie found it on YouTube, so she could see Spilled It, who is another Wildit's niece, or we think must be great niece.
Yes, and I was interested because she was voiced by Ellie Bevan, who must have been a child at the time, I don't know how old, and I'd seen her in The Wild House a lot, and I'm just quite interested in what she's in, so there you are. And I thought she was very good at Spilled It.
And then they did make further use of her later as little Earp-Pip, Earpgore's niece. We'll mention Earpgore next, well, we've mentioned him a lot, but he is an Earpney, but he's less human-like than the other Earpneys because he's green. he's a mad scientist, so one might speculate maybe he turned himself green with weird experiments at some point. But then his mother, who's in it, is green, and little Pip, his niece, is green. So some Erpneys are obviously green.
Yes, and not a large proportion. I think if you have this conversation with a young person nowadays with the very excellent values that are instilled in them, they'd accuse us of being racist. But the thing is that only Gore's family appear to be green, so I think it's reasonable to wonder why.
Perhaps it's just some sort of genetic difference. Not defect, you'll notice I said, but difference.
Sort of like maybe being albino.
Yeah. And I think Gore, you've told me in the past, is your favourite, or was your favourite when you were little, or one of the main aspects that you liked about the show?
I think he was my favourite when I was little. If anyone would have asked me who's your favourite character, I would have said Gore. I found him very engaging. He's quite stimulating, isn't he? He has a very loud, very funny voice. He's always kind of shouting. He's visually quite stimulating. His lab coat is done up with a nappy pin and that kind of thing. And yes, I just used to sort of wake up and pay attention when he was there going, no, blah, blah, and that kind of thing. Now that I'm a bit older, I don't enjoy that quite so much, but I still think he's lots of fun. The actor doing him in that recording session we saw had some trouble saying all the lines like that and had to do several again. And as you were saying, 3 series must have just done it for him because he's not in the 4th one.
And there's someone else doing a rather poor impression of him, and I remember thinking, Gore's voice is really letting it down in what turns out to be the final series. He takes a while getting into the voice, doesn't he? It's not as extreme in the pilot, as is always the way in pilots of these things. They don't have the voices quite yet. And then by the time we're up to season 2, like in this recording session we saw, he's really going for it. I think you were quite enjoying his over-the-top performance during the session, weren't you?
Yes, I was. He and the other baddies were actually making me laugh, and I couldn't even see the animation, but I could imagine it. One thing I noticed about Gore when we were watching it was that when Zordrak leaves his body, and if he doesn't come back in time, it will crumble away because it turns to stone when he leaves it. I think I mentioned that. He wants Zordrak not to come back, not just because he's scared of him, but because he seems to think he's going to be able to be the king of Viltheed. And I just wonder, are the Erpneys going to let him get away with that? He doesn't seem to expect any opposition or anything.
I was wondering the same thing, and he says it again in Spilled It, season 2, when Zordrak left his body for the second time. So it's a recurring ambition of Gore's.
It's not like he can shoot lightning at them and be 100 times bigger than them and scare them with things the way that Zordrak did.
I suppose he thinks he should be in charge with his superior intellect. He actually tried to murder Blob, Fritters and Nug in that Spilled It episode, didn't he? By sabotaging their new aircraft that he built for them.
Yes, he really did. I thought that was a stage further than we'd seen on those early DVDs.
But he's very engaging, isn't he? Unlike Wilded, he is very wild, very over the top. And he just works. He could be a character that's just stupid and doesn't work at all and comes across as a complete joke and really drags the show down. But he just clicks and works and adds a lot to the show with his over-the-topness, which is something that we will say in an upcoming podcast about the character Guy Gisborne in Maid Marian and Her Merry Men. Very much the same sort of thing that Gore adds to the show that Guy adds to Maid Marian, the show.
A couple more things I'd like to say about Gore. One is that Zordrak does value him, which gives him a dimension that the other Erpneys don't have. He values them as a group, as a whole army, but individuals he doesn't give a crap about. But he knows that Gore's inventions ought to be useful, actually. Quite often they aren't, are they? And he was saying how he always makes crappy aeroplanes. I think we mentioned that earlier. He makes a vehicle and says, right, you're going to steal the Dreamstone in this vehicle, Blob. And it's no bloody good. He also makes a couple of other things, like a thing with which to hypnotise Rufus, sort of Zordrak, back and forth, hypnotic watch, Zordrak face sort of thing. And the invisibility potion, which was actually quite useful, although the plan didn't go perfectly and it wore off too soon and that kind of thing. So I think that's quite interesting. Zordrak scares the bejesus out of Urkel, but I don't think he's ever really going to kill him, because then he might be a bit stuck.
I was thinking perhaps Gore is the only truly evil Erpney. I mean, yes, like the other Erpneys, he's scared of Zordrak and thus serves him. But he does seem to want power for himself. He does seem to want the Dreamstone for himself. But like Beastman in the early episodes of the original He-Man cartoon, he's a bit conniving and a bit evil and may turn against his master given the opportunity. So he's not simply enslaved. A bit more to him there.
Yes, he has a sort of superiority complex because of his intellect, and one thing I noticed he was always saying, and the thing that was making him particularly grumpy, was his brilliant inventions in the hands of fools sort of thing, which I probably never noticed when I was young. I just used to like his funny voice and his funny mannerisms, and when we were having a swizz around YouTube and seeing what there was that was interesting, there's more than one episode where he's going around in this bath, isn't there?
Yeah.
Walking bath with like red water in it. It's very weird, and I was thinking, why is he going around in the bath? Why doesn't he have the bath in his own time and get out of the bath and put some clothes on to do this sort of thing? And I can't explain that, I'm afraid, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it's so weird.
I was saying Urkel really needs to invent, as you were mentioning, a decent aeroplane to get the Erpneys to the land of dreams and back with the Dreamstone. Their standard vehicle becomes the Whirlyped, which is actually in the pilot, and is powered by Frizz and Nug pedaling and Blob steering. And they use that a lot later on, but then in other early episodes they're not using Whirlyped, and Urkel's invented some different things. The snake undulation thing, which goes through the sea rather than through the mist of limbo, and he's got these rocket packs in one episode that fly them through the mist of limbo.
And they were pretty good, weren't they?
Yes, they were. That's the one with the invisibility potion, and that went wrong because they lost the Dreamstone after making it invisible. But the vehicle they have in the third episode, called the Knitted Balloon, is this knitted balloon, which is powered by toxic burps, which are made by the special concoction that Urkel has made. And it's absolutely impossible to control this knitted balloon. And it's working in conjunction with the plan where Zordrak goes in the form of the mist and possesses Amberley and steals the Dreamstone. Now, if they'd done that plan with a decent plane, it would have worked perfectly because Zordrak did possess Amberley, and that idea was quite cool. So, yeah, one of the baddies' main problems is poor vehicles, and really, Urkel's intellectually well up to creating a decent plane. He just can't seem to settle on the design he likes. The problem. Well, the other three main characters, and perhaps the three characters that actually have the most screen time in the show, as it turns out, I'd be rather surprised if it wasn't, are Sergeant Blob, Frizz, and Nug, listed as Corporal Frizz and Corporal Nug on the wiki. I'm not sure if that's officially confirmed anywhere, but it doesn't not make sense or anything. And despite the fact that Zordrak has all these hundreds of Erpneys in the army, and you do see that there are many, many, many of them at various times, it's always Blob, Frizz, and Nug, the main characters, the main active antagonists who go and try to get the Dreamstone. Sometimes do get the Dreamstone. Gets returned in different ways. And they are a funny and engaging trio. Frizz and Nug are a funny and engaging duo. Looking at the recording session, the man, Richard Tate, doing Bob, I thought that's a very good, very clever voice he's doing. I imagined he looked more like a sort of Sergeant Major character in real life, but he's just doing this very good voice, like a Dreammaker voice, but very good. And it is the highlight of the show, some of the Blob, Frizz and Nug interaction, isn't it? Which is a good thing, because we see a lot of it.
Yes, they're the ones who are trying to get the Dreamstone, which is the main thing happening in the show. So yes, they are on screen a lot. And nowadays, I think I would say Blob is my favourite character. He makes me laugh. He says the stupid things they're going to do in a sort of commanding officer tone of voice. Operation Look for or Begin kind of thing.
It's interesting they hadn't thought of that, whatever they do in Begin in the first series, and then they were well up to it by Spilled.
Yes, and also he says prepare to be, doesn't he? Prepare to be receiving instructions in the using of the death egg from Urgor. And of course, which I think I remember, prepare to be climbing the hill. And then Frizz says, as far as I remember, that it's not a hill, it's practically a cliff. And that's something I've always remembered as being hilarious, but probably he doesn't say that at all. He probably just says, it's a cliff, because it is a cliff.
And then Melvin Hayes, who voices Frizz, also said that in Summer Holiday, didn't he, when he was driving the bus up the mountain. So he always says, it's practically a cliff. In Summer Holiday, he said, I think it's a 1-in-1, which is the same thing.
Yes, very funny joke now that if there's a steep hill, we want Melvin Hayes to tell us how steep it is. But probably that scene's not exactly as I remember, but I expect it was a very funny one anyway. And probably that's all there is to say about Bob. So let's say a bit more about Frizz and Nog.
Well, they're very funny, aren't they, with their grumbling to each other.
Yes, they're always complaining about things, and on one of the DVDs, a very early example is Frizz worrying he's going to slip a disc.
That's right.
They take ages to get better, they do slip discs.
And Nog was saying was testing an invisibility potion on them without telling them, and that was illegal.
That's illegal, that is. And I said it's probably not illegal in the Land of Nightmares, which he thought was quite amusing.
And Frizz is always saying, why do we want to go to the land of dreams anyway? Why do we want to get the dreams there anyway? There's nothing in it for us.
And then he says, we never enjoy it when we get there.
That's right.
It's funny, they're not really supposed to be enjoying it.
And then when they're in the presence of Zordrak and are terrified, they remember, oh yeah, that's why we're doing that.
Yes, they're very good.
They do have some very funny conversations.
And I was saying there are much more successful Sancho and Pedro sort of thing from the Cities of Gold, in which they're just annoying. Not Frizz and Nog, Sancho and Pedro.
I'm sure part of the inspiration for Frizz, or part of what Melvin Hayes brings to the role, is what he used in Super Ted in the part of Skeleton. It was one of Texas Pete's two henchmen, along with Bulk. It's interesting when we had that DVD of Super Ted that we'd borrowed. Quite enjoying Melvin Hayes' Skeleton. I think he wants the song.
Yes, quite a camp performance, which is an interesting interpretation. Nothing wrong with that, of course.
Yes, Frizz is like Skeleton, a bit sort of finicky and complainy, but less camp, which is just a different way to go with the role.
Melvin Hayes is good fun. He was also in that Frankenstein film, 17-year-old Frankenstein, when it was probably already in his 20s. He's quite small and he hasn't got the deepest voice.
He's in Santa Claus the movie as one of the elves, Vendigo. He's the one who does the tailoring, I think. Yes, that's right, I can't remember his name. So there we go, that's the characters, that's the premise, and that's everything we think about it, really.
Yes, it says at the beginning, original concept and design by some guy, I forgot his name. But I said, yes, it's a good original concept and design, and 60% of it is pulled off very well. That's the 60% that is Zordrak, Gore, Blob, Frizz and Nog, and then the rest of it just isn't quite there, which is a shame.
Very ambitious, very interesting, and well worth a watch and a talk about, but not everything it could be. The same production crew made Bimble's Bucket, which you mentioned we would have to mention.
Yes, it's very much the same sort of thing. I don't think you really watched it, did you? Because you got bored of the Dreamstone, you were a bit older.
I don't think I watched it religiously. I remember seeing some of it. But yeah, if I was bored of the Dreamstone's formulaic ways, I didn't want to watch the whole thing happening again in a slightly different show, I suppose.
I think maybe the premise was a bit less limiting because Bimble's Bucket was a wishing bucket and you could get stuff out of the wishing bucket while the baddies were trying to steal it. So extra dimension there. It had the same basic characters. Bimble was Rufus and he
He looked a bit like a Noop, except he was brown.
Yeah, he was more like a rabbit than a Noop is like a rabbit, so like a cross between a Noop and a rabbit. And I don't really remember much about his character, but I think he was a sort of young, wanting to prove himself, would-be hero like Rufus. He pulls the bucket off the head of the guy who's got his head stuck in the bucket, who's this magic chief of the wishing bucket kind of thing.
Yeah, and he has a wife who's the wife of the magic bucket ruling man.
I want to say I don't think we actually see her when he has his first appearance, getting the bucket pulled off his head and giving it to Bimble as a token of his thanks and perhaps some kind of test to see if he's worthy or something like that.
I think you see them both independently in some episodes. Then it turns out they're married and both affiliated with the bucket. Kind of the opposite of Mr. and Mrs. Brawley.
So I guess that's Rufus and the Dream Maker and the Watts, and there isn't really an Amberley. Bimble's female companion is Teeny Weeny, voiced by Ellie Bevan, so obviously they realised she did a good job and gave her a regular main role, who lives in the bucket and has shelves of everything that you could wish for. Obviously it's a bit of a TARDIS, because, it's a little bucket and there's all this stuff in there, and you wish for something, and she puts it on this, catapult thing in the bottom of the bucket, and out it comes, and there it is. So you've got snowshoes to get through the Arctic landscape or whatever.
What I remember is that Bimble would ask for something, or wish for something, out of the bucket, and Teeny Weeny goes, "Oh, what sort of flying machine? What sort of this? What sort of that?" And I thought, God, just see what's in there and give him a selection. Not much of a wishing bucket. You get the Spanish Inquisition before you can actually get anything out of it.
My memory of that sort of thing is when he makes an extremely vague wish. I wish for something to get across this muddy swamp. And she says, well, what sort of thing? So maybe it's a bit in between those two extremes.
Maybe that leads on to the bit I was remembering, a flying machine. What sort of flying machine?
Yes, that should be specific enough, shouldn't it?
One that will fly me over the swamp. Not one that Earth created, hopefully.
Yes, but I think it's reasonable she wanted to know, well, what do you want to get you across this swamp? I don't think she should have to do all the thinking for him. So that was the goodies, and I don't know if they had another protagonist. I have an idea that they did, but I can't remember who it was.
Someone who looked after the nursery rhyme rainbow sheep or whatever they were.
Yes, all different coloured sheep. I think it was fairy stories, or perhaps it was nursery rhymes, or perhaps it was both. And yes, Bimble's people, I can't remember the name of the species, would harvest the sheep's wool, shear the sheep, spin the wool, whatever you have to do in between, and then it somehow made fairy tales. And that, I think, was supposed to be kind of like how the Dream Maker sends out dreams and protects people from nightmares. But the trouble is, it's got sort of all to do with the bucket. And it's all like, oh yes, here's the premise where these rabbit people spin nursery rhymes and fairy stories out of magical sheep's wool, and then it's not really got anything to do with whatever's going on in the episode. So that's a bit less successful than the Dream Maker and the Dreamstone, what they're up to. And then I do remember most of the baddies. Of course, the main baddie, the Zordrak, is called Queen Cack, which is some name, isn't it? She's not giant, and I can't remember if she's frightened the Erpney type people into serving her, or they do it for some other reason, but she wants the bucket, and I remember she gets hold of it at some point, and she wishes for power, and Teeny Weeny doesn't like that because she can't get it out of one of her drawers.
You have to wish for a thing.
And I do remember thinking, well, what thing does Queen Cack actually want? She wants power, she wants to have dominion over everybody. What thing can you use?
She wants a nice palace, really. I think the Vilfeed equivalent, where Queen Cack lived, was called Sludge City. And there was some sort of comment about pollution.
Didn't she kind of like it, though, because she was a sort of slug thing?
She doesn't really want anything then, does she?
No, so she gets the bucket and doesn't really know what to do with it. Maybe they were trying to make some kind of comment about having clear goals or realistic expectations or something like that. And her Frizz and Nug, and I don't remember if they had a Sergeant Blob with them some of the time, but most of the time they were by themselves, Bilge and Euler. Bilge was a man and Euler was a woman, and you may have noticed there are already a lot more female characters than in Dreamstone. It was a bit later on in years when someone said, well, hang on a minute, we don't have to have all the characters be male except for the woman. And they, as far as I remember, looked quite similar to Erkney's. I think they had spots somewhere on them. And they used to go around on these sort of pogo sticks that you sit on, which I find very memorable. And they were just boing, boing, boing around trying to get the bucket. And there was a character called Dolly Clackhanger, and I saw a picture of her on the internet with her assistant, who's some sort of blue animal creature thing called Sploot, I think. And they're after the bucket too, but I can't really remember anything else about them, and I don't know if they're a bit like Urp-Gore, or they're anything to do with Queen Cack. So there you are. I remember some things quite well, and some things not at all.
And I remembered this antagonist called Mudge, who I think was like boarding with Dolly Clackhanger in her house, and I think he was an estate agent for some reason. Maybe he was trying to find Queen Cack a nicer palace or something. Can't really remember.
I don't remember that at all, and I didn't actually bother looking it up, but there's scant information about it on the internet. There are some episodes on YouTube, but I didn't really feel I wanted to watch any in preparation, so I haven't, sorry.
I was wondering if perhaps Bimble's bucket is virtually impossible if the Dreamstone is Nightmare. It's a different, less well thought out, less successful version, pretty much the same thing.
Yes, I guess perhaps the guy who makes them thought, well, I can't really think of any more ways for them to try and steal the Dreamstone, and Urp-Gore's got the wrong voice anyway, and he sort of tried to start the same thing over again with a bit more scope by having the wishing bucket, and unfortunately, because the Dreamstone was the original, it was also the best.
Maybe if you're slightly younger than us and you come into Bimble's bucket and didn't really know the Dreamstone, you might appreciate it in a different way and on a different level, but that's not the case with us.
I quite enjoyed watching it when I watched it, but, I've sort of had enough of my life.
And that's enough of this particular podcast, which hopefully you found very enjoyable. Do join us again next time on the final Sunday in November for a podcast on
what you mentioned earlier, Maid Marian and Her Merry Men.
Yes, it's going to be time to talk about Guy of Gisborne and the rest of the gang already. So until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.